Dave, you're on too. If you can turn on your camera.
Yep.
We won't let you go that easy, Dave. So a bit more. Cool. Before we go in the demo, we definitely have a few practitioners. Kapil, who has done it in many organizations, who actually the lead maintainer for the Cloud Custodian project as well, which we mentioned earlier, is the central piece of this movement towards governance as code. We also have today Naor from FICO. He's a senior director of product security there. Thanks for joining us. I know it's pretty late for you, Naor, so thank you so much for joining us as well. David, you already talked about in a bit, so let's get the conversation started, right? If you have any questions, feel free to type them in there. But let's get into it. So Kapil, I guess my first question was, why did you start Cloud Custodian in the first place? Didn't people have enough enterprise tools, like David mentioned before? Why did you have to come up with another one? What were the drivers?
So, I mean, enterprises have lots of tools that do lots of different things. And we at Capital One, when I was starting the Cloud Custodian project, we had a number of them, but we noticed a lot of problems with them. The first one that was primary was resource coverage. We wanted to be a cloud-first organization and have developers adopt the latest and greatest. We can use it at everything from machine learning to call centers. And the extant tools just had significant coverage gaps. And I think part of the reason that we open source Cloud Custodian was believing that open source is the only way to keep up with this pace of innovation from the cloud providers. So not just cover, because that long tail for the cloud providers just gets longer and longer as service teams release new features. The other issue was around how these tools behaved. They ended up being sort of big walls of red in certain teams and parts of the organization's offices. And what we really wanted to enable was that real-time remediation to enable organizations to fix issues, not simply triage them. And then getting to sort of the real world around exception management, org-specific policies, and I think we touched as well on decentralized policy management. You might have some policies that are across the org. You might have some policies that apply to particular dev accounts in different environments. And not a lot of the tools out there were really very flexible about that. So like most organizations, we started doing one-off scripts, to try to handle the particular needs, but we quickly realized that wouldn't scale on development time, the operations around them, the transparencies to the developers in the environment. So the first commit to Cloud Custodian was almost 60 years ago to the day. And it started as a holistic approach that would allow us to scale to thousands of controls while empowering developers to pick their choice of tools and bring transparency to the controls in a given environment, all while managing those policies as code artifacts in version control.
Great. So Naor, coming to you, what were drivers in your organizations? I know you have a more of a security background and Kapil more of a cloud engineering. What were some of your drivers?
So I think, we are talking about governance as code, but maybe taking a step back from governance as code. In my view, everything should be as code, not just governance. Maybe governance is the first piece towards security being an as code organization. But, reflecting back on my career, when you're taking 20 years back and you're thinking about the root cause or the root evil of why security is security today, you are coming to a few points. The first one is inconsistencies. At the end of the day, every project, every team got a different approach into how to do stuff. You might have went to the same architect day in, day out, and every day will say something different, right? That inconsistency was intolerable for a business and probably not as fruitful for security as well. The second point is the lack of understanding, which in my view probably is the biggest thing and the biggest change in security and in code in general for security. At the end of the day, 20 years ago and still today in many, many teams, we don't really understand the business. We don't really understand what the business is trying to achieve. Are they trying to achieve that? And what is their goal? And we are seeing more and more transformations that essentially at the end of the day help us deliver security with the understanding of what the business is doing. So I can understand how security, and we are a software company, out 20 or even 10 or even 5 years ago, when the development ended, given that it was secure and everything, still the IT got in some artifact that they now need to deploy without really understanding what is the impact. And security said, oh, we don't know, that's a web server, let's put a web application firewall in front of it. Just because we don't really understand what it needs to do. We need to do a lot of things because we don't understand the business of the company. And I think that is essentially changing with code because the product is code, right? How it's being deployed is in code, right? How it's being managed is also in scaling, and everything is also in code. So why not security? Why not be able to prescribe everything in code? And I think that the last point about that is security. Again, traditionally we were pretty much paper pushers in the sense that we would have written a very big manifest with a lot of things that we expect, and we didn't necessarily do the right amount of job in making sure that is actually what's happening in real time. And even if we have, you're writing a design for some system, probably after a month, it's already an archaeological artifact. It is no longer applicable because they've already released something, they've changed it, the environment is live. We cannot stay in the past. And this is where being able to see what the product team is trying to achieve, what the IT is building and how they're building it, enables us as security to be much more agile in our approach to enabling them to be more secure at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I guess if David, if I come back to you, you've been implementing and advising organizations for cloud for years, right? You've written hundreds of blogs on it, probably on the topic of governance as well. What's the single most exciting thing about governance as code?
I think because it gets to the paradigm shift and the fact that we're moving to software engineering focused and pushing a lot of things down to people who are building the applications. And so we're empowering them to make decisions in terms of infrastructure, security, and governance as to how they can configure those things to properly meet the needs of the application. So, governance is guardrails, and we're able to do guardrails with developers in mind and things that are purpose-built for the application. So it works within the DevOps lifecycle tool chains. All those things that are traditionally focused on development now certainly works with the Agile methodology. And we're pushing the responsibility of governance down to the developers, not because we're trying to make their lives more complex, but because we're empowering them to take their systems to the next level. Think about it, one of the biggest blockers to folks who are moving to the cloud is the fact that they view the governance systems that have to be implemented as something that's too complex and won't scale, things we talked about in the last session. So ultimately, if we're going to force it to be centralized, we're going to force the developers to work in some sort of a central thing where you're building on top of things and on top of things and on top of things versus things that are specifically built to optimize your applications. That's not going to work. And so we're able to leverage governance code. It kind of removes that barrier. So in other words, we're able to deal with security, able to deal with operations. Now we're able to deal with governance as what it truly is, something that should be engineered into the application and therefore custom built to specific needs of the application, therefore optimized.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, what are some of the cultural changes that organizations have to face in order to adopt this?
Well, we have to think in terms of things going to be more software engineering focused, and software engineers are going to be empowered to deal with infrastructure and governance. So, traditionally, functions like security were aligned to tools and technology. They were centrally controlled. We had a central bunch of security engineers and SecOps, security operations folks, which controlled it. Now, that worked to a certain degree, but moving forward, looking at governance and security, those are going to be better implemented in a distributed way like we just saw. So now the culture is to empower the software engineers to take the software functions and infrastructure functions and build them directly into the applications. Now we think about it, if we're moving into a very complex world, and certainly things are getting more complex, our ability to enable applications to work in an efficient way in these complex environments need to put volatility into the domain within the applications that are bound to the applications. The volatility can't be centralized because just by the means of centralized via logic, the more volatility that we put into that domain, the more complex it's going to be and the more it's unable to scale. So the culture needs to be thinking about how we're enabling the engineers to making the best decisions, picking the best technology, whether it's the best of breed technology, and how we're going to independently optimize governance and empower them to do so at the application level. So it's all about the software engineer now.
Great. So now, what are some of the challenges that you face in terms of adoption and implementation?
Yeah, so I think, and I concur 100% with what David said. I do think that the first point is transparency. I think that one of the challenges that we have faced is the ambiguity in the things that we are doing, and sometimes when things break or fail or they don't make sense, then it is very hard to recover from that. Not necessarily as a security breach, right? I'm talking about just an environment is being deployed and now it's coming down and you don't really understand why. And it takes you a few hours to understand why it happened until you find that, sort of security control that blocked you. That level of transparency that is becoming available with governance as code is amazing because everyone has full transparency and is able to see exactly what is being anticipated and how it is being delivered. The second point, which I completely concur with David, is the guardrails. Essentially, at the end of the day, we want to expedite our ability to deliver security and not block the business. The idea is to enable the teams to be much faster. And when you're thinking about traditional security, where every time you're onboarding something, it will take you hours in the very, very best case scenario, and maybe days and weeks if it is even less modern. And you're thinking about, now I have one manifest that I can just deploy and it is live in a few minutes. I mean, that is just security really visualizing and really enabling or consuming the value that the cloud has to offer. I mean, everyone in security are afraid of the cloud or are afraid of the cloud. I think of that as an amazing opportunity because now you have the ability to actually execute very fast on the things that you wanted to do in the first place and was very hard a couple of years ago. And the last point, which again comes back to what David mentioned, is the security-driven or the product security drivers. At the end of the day, and again, this is, in my view, at least coming a little bit into the future of how governance is code and how security as code will look like. At the end of the day, you are thinking about as a product. Today, again, you have the source code of the product, you have the manifests that are deploying it. There is no real reason why us as security professionals cannot take that, add on top of it the controls that we want, but more importantly, essentially enable us to identify drift and make sure that nothing changes outside the scope of what the product team wanted to achieve. So that's whitelisting right ahead for you guys, right? Security people always said whitelisting is impossible, whitelisting is impossible. Infrastructure as code is enabling us to run whitelisting because you know exactly what is the ingress, you know exactly what is the egress, you know exactly what should be able, how, and it's written very, very nicely and neatly in the spec file itself. So it's just a matter of leveraging that to actually enable security. So in my view, governance as code will move forward from just being able to articulate those guardrails into us actually being able to enforce and account for the things that the product team wants. So they're getting exactly what they wanted, the freedom, the agility that they need to deliver their product. And we're getting even more than what we have asked for. We are getting a very, very confined runtime environment that is very, very strict, which is, again, a very, very big reduction in the attack surface as a whole.
No, that's great. So once you've overcome these challenges, what are some of the early benefits have you been seeing in your organization?
So the first thing that I have observed is that people are nicer to us in security. I want to say. I mean, and this might sound funny, but at the end of the day, security has always been that nasty counterpart that you are coming at the end of the development when everything is ready, and they are just taking a month to evaluate and now sending you back to the drawing board on so many things, right? So when you're thinking about infrastructure as code, into governance as code, and of course into product security lifecycle as a whole, our ability to work with them very, very early on, and starting with the infrastructure specs, but moving upwards into the open API specs, like the contracts between services, and the way that they're being structured, essentially enabled us to be a part of the team, reach much, much lower amount of defects that we need to treat as a part of the lifecycle, as well as being able to proactively know what is happening in our production environment in a way that will let us, again, we will be able to tell if something is acting unorthodoxly, so essentially acting up in a different way than it was expected. So I think that is the first point. The second point is the continuous posturing. One of the challenges is that security was always a point-in-time thing. You have a risk assessment, bam, you have a report, everyone are happy, you don't know what happens a week afterwards, right? The ability to have continuous posturing into what's happening in your environment is critical for our success because when you're releasing a lot of times a day, even if you're not releasing a lot of times a day, some engineer might access your cloud environment and make some change. You want that to be authored, you want that to be audited, you want to know that something changed, and you want to know that it was manual, because if someone changed something manually, tomorrow morning when you will redeploy that manifest, the same manifest, something will break, right? So the ability to know that things are changing in real time, the ability to govern them and make sure they're aligned with your expectation, and your ability to drive that expectation as early as the person that is writing how he's expecting his product to work and his environment to work. I think that those are the biggest benefits that we definitely had.
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's a question here too, Kapil. I had a question for you, but I'll let you answer the question in the chat for now. How challenging is it to adopt this concept to a brownfield application or architecture? Would that be more challenging than the greenfield ones, where you could start from the beginning?
Yeah, I think you can, that's a very real world question. And I would say Cloud Custodian was born in the real world. And so this maybe goes beyond purely governance as code to particular implementations and tools. From a custodian perspective, the ability to stop the bleeding, so to speak, by having active remediation on the net new, and then to look at the extant and start working through workflows of remediations where you give people 30 days notice, and then you give them a nagging email for a week, and then you start stopping things, and then you start terminating things. That ability to do graduated remediation through what's extant is very much the first class capability of custodian, and I think it is a key part of handling the real world with governance as code.
Okay. Before I go into other audience questions, I know Liam has been answering a few. I just wanted you to highlight what is Staccat doing beyond Cloud Custodian as well, beyond maintaining the projects and leading on that forefront with the community. What are some of the other cool stuff that Stacklet is working on to enable organizations to adopt governance as code?
So we're starting off with a platform for managing governance as code across large environments in a GitOps-centric fashion, with reporting and dashboards, but also enabling the hierarchical management and application of policies to different parts of the org. Custodian itself comes as a CLI without sort of any trying to be very open-ended with regards to how an organization wants to deploy. This represents a platform that operates at scale to deliver that value out of the box. And next is sort of policy packs. There are commercially supported policies on a variety of best practices and standards to, again, help unlock the value of custodian and governance as code out of the box for organizations. Another component is a real-time database of assets with event metadata that can be queried using standard SQL, and it's built using by introspecting the underlying SDKs of the cloud, such that it's evergreen with regard to new features. And with event metadata, being able to answer who and what made a resource change. So we use this to also help us be the most efficient way to execute Cloud Custodian policies at scale. And finally, we're also have built out something that we call Communications Hub as a means of enabling the at-scale behavior changes by driving through notifications without sort of the fatigue that we see in some of our open source counterparts.
Great. I think you'll definitely get a sneak peek about 5 to 10 minutes with Liz and Liam on that for anyone who's interested. But looking at some of the chat things that were brought up, thank you, Nikki. I think a very well thought out point is that governance as code also allows organizations to know how exactly others have solved similar problems, and you can get pointers from others too, right? It becomes a mechanism for sharing best practices as well. So I think that's a great point. Another thing is, what are your thoughts on how to keep up with the pace of change introduced by cloud providers and ensure that correct governance as code is there? So the cloud providers are always changing. Maybe Kapil, you can start and Naor can add. If the cloud providers are continuously changing, how do you ensure correct governance as code there?
So, I think it starts off with good IAM practices. The best problem to solve is via prevention. The best way to solve problems is via prevention, and a good IAM policy that can help only enable services that are in features that have been gone through the org's vetting process is a key aspect of that. But beyond that, I think it comes out to being open source, to be helping by creating a community around the governance tool itself, such that everyone that has a particular need can enable self-service. In the same similar fashion to how Terraform allows integrations across many features across the cloud. Cloud Custodian has over 300 contributors and covers off on everything from IoT to remote desktops to machine learning to serverless and databases. And all that was contributed on the basis of users having particular needs around capabilities that the cloud providers were producing and contributing that back to the upstream. So very much think that the only realistic fashion to deal with this is as a community of cloud adopting organizations.
Okay, great. Naor, would you add anything to that, David?
Yeah, actually, so I agree with Kapil. I do think that governance as code enables something more. At the end of the day, it provides us, assuming that we as a community, as an industry, agree on the right syntax and formulation of declarative way of describing what we're looking to achieve. I can definitely see a future in which we as an organization will come and say, you shouldn't have internet-facing endpoints in some code fashion. And at the end of the day, the backend system, let's assume custodian, right, will be able to take that and apply that across all of the features of AWS. By that, granting us the ability to have that continuous posturing and also the ability to potentially control the usage of new services. I do agree that within the production environments and environments that are highly sensitive, you definitely want to restrict exactly which services are being used and how they're being used. But even so, even for lower environments, for sandboxes and such, I do think that the same guardrails can make sense in a way that they will not necessarily require us to run all the time after new technologies, but actually enabling the community to say, okay, you meant no endpoints for this service, this is how we will implement that. And then actually enabling that sort of Rosetta Stone type of scenario where we will say our piece, and at the end of the day, the backend will be applied across the board.
Okay, great. So now, while we have you, just to wrap it up, what's the advice you would give your peers who are just getting started?
Yeah, so I would probably start with embrace transparency. I mean, one of the things in code in general is that it's transparent and open. Security through obscurity should have died a long time ago, but if it hasn't, then we should definitely put the final nail in the coffin there. So that would be the first point. The second point is, in my view, try to start and think about every policy, every procedure, every control you're describing. Try thinking about it from an operational aspect. How would you articulate that in an operational function if you needed to? So not necessarily go ahead and learn the entire syntax for Cloud Custodian as a starting point, but definitely understand that saying, you shouldn't have opened something is not declarative enough. You need to start thinking about things from a more operational way. And as you become more proficient with the technology and with the syntax, you will be able to articulate that much, much easier. But it is important to avoid the ambiguity of the traditional security policies and procedures, which in some cases make sense, and start moving into more operational and declarative ways of thinking about how you are achieving security.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Kapil, would you add anything? What advice would you give someone just getting started?
No. I think Naor covered it pretty well. I'll hand it over to David.
Yeah. I know Wada asked a question that was everybody able to hear the questions? I'm guessing Kapil and Naor could. So let us know if you're having issues hearing me. But I was asking the panelists, like, what would be the one advice you would give to someone getting started with governance as code? So David, would you have any advice?
Yeah, my advice has changed over the last 10 years. I think it's a just do it, situation now. So in other words, get started and get out there and experiment with the technology. It doesn't mean implement the technology haphazardly in a particular project, but put together some straw mans and some pilot projects as to how it's going to work. And you'll find that as the technology is successful, people will line up behind it. So you'll get the cultural changes that go along with the success. So instead of just planning things out and and probably spending a lot of too many times in meetings, get a pilot project together, get the technology configured, and go off and start building and deploying and changing some rudimentary applications, whether they're moving to the cloud or not. And you'll find that it becomes clearer to you in a shorter period of time, and you'll have a more likely chance of success.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. With that, we'll put the panel on a wrap. I hope everyone.